Today on Path of Learning, we're going to talk about one of the most important aspects of character building in Path of Exile, defenses. Whether you're a seasoned veteran or just starting out, this guide's going to have something for you. The key to defenses is layering them, so that the strength of one layer covers for the weaknesses of another. And to do that, you need to understand the defenses in Path of Exile, plus their innate synergies. The easiest way to do this is by using three broad categories: avoidance, mitigation, and recovery. Now it's important to note that in-game defenses refer to armor, evasion, energy shield, and ward, but players use the term more broadly to encapsulate anything that helps you stay alive. Avoidance is all about preventing hits or preventing damage. This can include evasion, block chance, or chance to avoid damage from hits. But you're going to take damage from a hit eventually, and that's where mitigation comes in, because mitigation is all about reducing the damage you take when you do get hit or are afflicted by a damage over time effect. This includes things like armor, elemental resistances, and physical damage reduction. The key is to use mitigation in combination with other defenses to make sure you're not vulnerable to any particular type of damage. And finally, there's recovery. No matter how good your defenses are, you're going to take damage eventually. And that's where recovery comes in. Things like life regeneration, leech, or life gain on hit can help bring your health up quickly so you don't die to the next instance of damage. Therefore, to make a great build in Path of Exile, you need solid, well-layered defenses, by combining avoidance, mitigation, and recovery in a way that covers for each other layer's weakness. You'll have a build that feels invulnerable in no time. And if you like learning about the mechanics in Path of Exile, or need to know how to make your build, then do be sure to get subscribed, because this won't be the only Path of Learning episode, and if you're not subbed, you might miss future uploads. But for now, let's get into layering defenses in Path of Exile. Of course, by layering your defenses, you can end up with a health pool that is effectively infinite, at least if the hit size is small enough. This is obviously going to vary, because defenses aren't completely universal. And again, the different types of defenses work in different ways. Avoidance is all about not getting hit, and unfortunately, most types of avoidance are capped below 100% to prevent you from becoming immune to damage. So there's usually an element of randomness here. If you have a 75% chance to avoid a hit, say by blocking it, 75% of the time you take 0 damage, and 25% of the time you take the full damage, at least if you have no other defensive layers. Therefore, evasion can be thought of as the first or outermost defensive technique. Then after avoidance, we have mitigation. Mitigation is what you need when you do get hit and are going to take damage. A really good example of mitigation is armor. This is very popular across many builds, because armor mitigates physical hit damage. When combined with the Molten Shell Guard skill, it can also mitigate all other types of hit damage. As you may have guessed, mitigation usually protects against something fairly specific, so you'll need either different types of mitigation or different defensive layers to be truly well-rounded. Mitigation is particularly important for protecting against critical strikes or bosses. Next up, we have recovery. You're probably most familiar with recovery from the Humble Life Flask, something that you should be familiar with from early in your Path of Exile journey. Recovery is what keeps you from dying as damage accumulates across multiple instances. So now that I've talked about the different defensive layers and what they are, I'm going to get into each and go into some of the specific mechanics which you can utilize. The first of which is evasion, one of the actual defensive stats from PoE. Evasion gives you up to a 95% chance to evade an attack hit. This is good for protecting against attacks, it protects against hits, and it uses an entropy system, meaning you are unlikely to take 2 hits consecutively, but you are almost guaranteed to take a hit eventually. At least within a 6-second window, assuming that you're getting hit often enough. RNG is RNG after all, but since it's capped at 95%, you should still be taking 1 hit in 20. A great example of scaling evasion is via the Grace Aura. Then we have Block, which is one of my personal favorites. Block is extremely versatile, because with something like Glancing Blows, it functions more like mitigation, and with the Aegis Aurora Shield, it functions more like recovery, while also having all of the avoidance benefits mentioned previously, at least in the case of Aegis Aurora. You are still hit when you block, but you suffer no ill effects from the hit, at least unless you're taking Glancing Blows. But more about that in a little bit. Then we have a chance to avoid damage from hits. In this case, the enemy hits you, but you take no damage. Chance to avoid damage from hits is most commonly found through Elusive, and unfortunately is unreliable as a result, Don't use this as one of your core defensive layers, use it on top of an already strong defense. Now, Spell Dodge is an interesting one. It's exclusive to the Acrobatics Keystone, and it makes a different defensive layer in many ways worse. Normally, Spell Suppression is mitigation, and 100% reliable. Now, you can replace that with a 75% chance to take no damage from a spell hit. Personally, I don't think that trade-off's worth it, but there might be niche situations where it is worth considering. Then, Ailment Avoidance. Elemental Ailment Avoidance is incredibly important. Shock can absolutely ruin your day by causing you to take 50% more damage. Ignite will degenerate you and burn through your health in seconds. If you're frozen, you can't move, act, or fight back. So, mitigating elemental ailments is very important, and this is done through a variety of ways. Things like Eldritch Implicits and the Aura Purity of Elements excel at dealing with ailments, though that's far from an exhaustive list. Now, for some reason you aren't able to avoid an ailment, you could reduce the effect or the duration. Reducing the effect means it won't negatively impact you. You'll still be shocked, but the shock won't cause you to take increased damage. And if you reduce the duration, the shock might be applied for a split second, say by the hit that inflicts it, and then do nothing at all. It should be noted for non-damaging ailments, reducing the duration generally isn't a good idea, but for something like Ignite it can be highly effective. Next up, we have mitigation, things that you do after you've been hit and are at the stage of taking damage. First up, like I mentioned before, we have armor. This works against physical hits, it will not protect against damage over time like bleed, and normally it won't protect against elemental damage either. A really common source of armor is the Determination Aura. Now, when I said it won't protect against damage over time, what I meant is it won't protect against damage over time by default. The Transcendence Keystone, available from Timeless Jewels, do in fact allow you to use armor to protect against ele damage. This stacks with your resistances, but comes with a major downside: losing max res. You can do something like pair it with a Lore Weave to help shore up your resistances in that regard, but you'll still be very vulnerable to phys damage if you don't have an alternative source of physical mitigation. On the other hand, Spell Suppression is very easy to fit into a build. It means that you have to use some evasion gear and give up a few suffixes, but it is well worth it, especially if you're on the right side of a tree near the ranger or shadow area. Having a 100% chance to suppress spell damage halves the damage you take from spell hits, along with some other additional benefits. On the other hand, resistances are just a core part of Path of Exile. The game's balanced around them, and if you want to know more about resists, I suggest checking out my previous Path of Learning episode where I go over resistances. But the quick TLDR is you want 75% fire, cold, and lightning, and as close to 75% chaos as you can get. They protect against these damage types, and the game is balanced around you having that. On the other hand, reduced or less damage taken is usually a nice way to magnify other types of mitigation defenses. Some common examples here include something like Slayer's Brutal Fervor, Frigid Wake from the Occultist, or Elemental Flasks, which cause you to take less damage of the specific element the flask protects against, so less fire damage for a Ruby Flask. Having these reductions is very important if you want to make a truly tanky character. It should be noted, much like damage multipliers, reduced and less are treated differently. Reduced combines additively, whereas less combines multiplicatively. To use a very simple example, if you have two sources of 50% reduced damage taken, they would combine to 100%, making you immune to damage. Unless, of course, you took 10% increased damage, in which case it would only be 90% total. Whereas, if you have less damage taken, 50 and 50 combine to 0.5 times 0.5, so you'd still take 25% of damage, or have a 75% reduction. Then there's damage shifting, which causes one type of damage to be taken as another. This is a very good way to defend against physical damage and make your armor more effective, because armor's effect is proportional to the intensity of the hit, being more effective against small ones than large ones. If you take half of your physical damage as fire, you can think of this as armor being over twice as effective. It should be noted that shifting is not conversion and works very differently. Once damage has been shifted, it cannot be shifted again, and while shift does not necessarily apply to hits, many instances do state with hits, in which case that will not apply to damage over time effects. Ward, on the other hand, acts as temporary health, or a shield that blocks a flat amount of damage. All of your ward is consumed on hit, unless you're using something like the Old Roth's Resolve Flask. So, it is equally good at protecting against small and large hits, and isn't very effective against multiple rapid hits. So while Ward could be quite nice against bosses, it isn't something you want to use while mapping. On the other hand, guard skills are another Path of Exile staple. Almost every build uses one. The most common is Molten Shell, since that has a great synergy with armor, something that's quite commonly used. But there are cases where you'll want Steel Skin, Arcane Cloak, or even Immortal Call. Each of these offer a powerful temporary bonus, followed by some downtime. You can often scale the duration with skill effect duration, and you can scale the cooldown with cooldown recovery rate, meaning as you invest into your guard skills, they do become more effective. Now, much like players, enemies can also crit, and enemy crits can be devastating. So to become truly tanky, you want critical strike mitigation. This is often found on the top left side of a tree, near the Templar starting area, or as corrupted implicits on chest pieces and shields. In this example, the Aegis Aurora has 25% reduced extra damage taken from critical strikes. At 100%, the enemy will still technically crit you, but they'll do no extra damage, thus rendering the crit negated. Now, much like Ward, Aegis effects act as temporary health, but unlike Ward, they don't break after a single hit. Instead, they have a damage absorption value. This can either be a fixed value in the case of Magna Eclipsis, or a scaling value in the case of Elementalist's Bastion of Elements. Because Aegis effects only protect against one damage type, you will need to combine them with other things. However, they can be a great way to add a little bit of extra effective health to your build. Somewhat similar to damage shifting, there's damage taken before life. This is kind of a default effect of Energy Shield. Non-chaos damage is applied to Energy Shield before life, so you could think of this as 100% of damage applied to Energy Shield before life. Another way to do this that's very common is Mind Over Matter. It applies a percent of your damage taken to mana before life. Note the wording there though, mana before life, not mana before Energy Shield. So the order would now be, most damage hits your Energy Shield first, then a portion goes to your life and a portion goes to your mana. Or, chaos damage, a portion goes to your life and a portion goes to your mana. There are, of course, other mechanics for damage taken before life, but in general, you want to recover whatever resource you're shifting the damage over to. And finally, the last form of mitigation is life loss prevention. This is an interesting one because it erases damage from existence, and usually replaces it with a life loss effect. A perfect example of this is the Progenesis Flask that comes from the Maven. When hit during the effect, 25% of life loss from damage taken occurs over 4 seconds instead. This means that if you would have been one-shot, you're instead knocked to low life and inflicted with a somewhat nasty dot. Luckily, if your build has good recovery, you should be able to erase that dot damage entirely, effectively giving you a second life. And in fact, on that theme, this will synergize very well with the Occultist's 9 lives node that I'll get into in just a little bit. Now we get to our third and final category of defenses, recovery, the thing which brings your health back up after you've taken damage. For example, the Humble Life Flask, something that almost everyone's familiar with, and many people still run in their build. You can of course modify the base recovery to cause it to recover more life over its duration, recover that life faster, or even recover it instantly. Judging by the raw numbers, life flasks aren't the strongest form of recovery. However, they do have one very nice advantage. Life flasks are active recovery. You can use them to react to a situation. Though, if you feel like you're a potato, maybe this is actually a downside and you'll want a more passive method, such as regeneration. With life regeneration, it causes your life to constantly go up at a fixed rate. There's 2 types. Percentile regeneration, which scales off of your max life, and is good for builds that have higher amounts of life, or flat regeneration, such as from a Vitality Aura, that's very good for builds with relatively small amounts of life. Since it's passive and permanent, life regeneration is a great way to add recovery to your build that's always going to be there whether you need it or not. But on the other hand, if you're always hitting enemies, you can probably count on Leech. It works in many ways similar to life regen, being scaled by a percentage of your health, but requires you to hit enemies and technically does draw from a percentage of the damage you deal to them. However, player damage numbers are absolutely absurd relative to player health pools, so in most cases, you'll be at the Leech cap anyway. Now, unfortunately, Leech is one of the most convoluted and complicated mechanics in PoE, so I suggest reading the article for this one rather than trying to understand it just based on the video. Just know that there's a lot of ways to modify it, and it's only effective if you're able to hit enemies. Usually it's removed when you reach full life, though certain effects, such as those granted by the Slayer Ascendancy, can modify that behavior. Recoup, on the other hand, is a passive reactive form of defense, because it reacts to your damage taken, causing you to heal for a percentage of it. Remember how I mentioned before with Progenesis, you can turn a percentage of the damage you take into a dot? What if you also turned that percentage into a heal? That's right, by combining Recoup and something like Progenesis or Petrified Blood, you can in fact cancel out a portion of the damage you take. Now, because Recoup triggers off of you taking damage, you do have to take damage for it to do anything. But that also means the healing will almost always be effective and come when you need it, rather than at a time where you're full life anyway. There are many effects in Path of Exile, which modify life recovery rate. In some cases, this can be an advantage, making it go faster. In other cases, this can be a disadvantage, slowing it down or preventing it entirely by setting the rate to 0. If you don't want to deal with that at all, try gain per enemy hit. A good example of this is claw weapons in Path of Exile that have a gain per hit implicit. So if you have a claw with grants 38 life per enemy hit, every time you hit an enemy, you will get 38 life. If you're hitting 10 enemies or one enemy 10 times, that's 380 life. Life gain on hit is an instant form of recovery, which makes it absolutely amazing. Yes, you do still have to hit stuff, but this is one of the best mapping defenses in the game, since you're usually hitting dozens of enemies at once and attacking quite rapidly. Now normally, recharge is an effect innate to Energy Shield. When not full, your Energy Shield recharges after a delay. You can both modify the recharge rate to make it go faster, and modify the delay to reduce it, thus starting the recharge faster. Though there are some interesting effects like Eternal Youth that allow you to recharge life instead. Recharge is another effect that is reactive, meaning you have to take damage for it to do anything, but it does come with a downside that if you take damage while recharging, the recharge is interrupted, thus causing you to wait again. So it's often paired with something like evasion, thus preventing you from taking consecutive hits. If you like the idea of a reactive defense, but don't like the idea of having it happen over time, Recover or Replenish will absolutely be for you. A good example of this is the Aegis Aurora Shield. Aegis Aurora replenishes a portion of your energy shield on block, scaling off of your armor. This way, when an enemy hits you and you block the hit, you erase damage that you previously took, or you can combine this with Glancing Blows to erase damage from the current hit. This is why Aegis Aurora builds simply don't die to small hits. And because it's instant, Recovery or Replenish is not affected by something like 60% reduced life recovery rate. Another way to get it, instead of on block, is on kill. Though Recovery on kill is strictly not very useful for bossing, since once you've killed the boss, the fight is already over. And finally, last but not least, an interesting form of recovery called Dissolution of the Flesh. This works completely different from every other form of recovery in that it replaces all of them. With Dissolution, you no longer take damage. Instead, any damage you would have taken is turned into life reservation. That means this doesn't work with Energy Shield builds, and that you want to have a significant amount of life for the build to function correctly. Much like Energy Shield Recharge, it's interrupted by constant damage, so you'll want to pair it with layers of avoidance. But if that is the case, once you haven't taken damage for a little bit, the reservation ends, instantly restoring you to full life. Dissolution of the Flesh also allows you some interesting ways to combine with more niche defenses like Petrified Blood. Now that you know how the different defensive layers work, how might you go about combining them? Well, in this example, we have a build set up for mapping. Spell Suppression is great for mitigating enemy spell damage. Evasion means you won't take consecutive attack hits. To deal with the things that you fail to evade, we're adding in some armor to round out the mitigation. Chance to avoid elemental ailments is quite easy to access from a ranger area of a tree, and as a Deadeye build, we'll want to fit that in to completely mitigate Shock, Sap, Chill, Freeze, Brittle, Ignite, and Scorch. This also means that your flask suffixes will be free for other types of defenses, such as evasion or armor. Finally, for the recovery, we've got life gain on hit, and as a mapping build, you won't even need a life flask. The biggest weakness for a build like this would be large elemental hits from bosses, or maybe a supermassive crit, though I don't think many enemies are going to be critting you with the amount of evasion this build has. So while something like an Uber boss would pose a particular challenge to a build like this, if you're mapping on it, it's going to feel incredible. You'll be super tanky and have defensive layers to deal with every damage type you'll encounter. The rare exception being physical damage over time, but as long as you can hit enemies, life gain on hit will take care of that as well. On the other hand, let's say you do want to fight uber bosses. What might that look like? To tank uber bosses, truly overkill defenses are needed, and that's where you get a setup like this Cast on Crit Forbidden Right build. It's a Chaos Inoculation build, so chaos damage immediately is out of the equation. We're just immune. And because this build uses Aegis Aurora, it's pretty safe to bet that we'll also have Glancing Blows to make it easier to cap both block and spell block. From there, you definitely want armor. Not only does this add physical mitigation, but it scales your Aegis Aurora. Now, speaking of, Aegis Aurora gives 5% max cold, so stack on a Purity of Ice and Melting of the Flesh. Throw in a few Eldritch Implicits, you'll have 90% all elemental resistance. This means you're now very resistant to physical, fire, cold, and lightning hits, while being totally immune to chaos hits or chaos dots. Furthermore, depending on the boss you fight, you might actually want to swap one of the elemental flasks out for a granite or basalt flask. If you know a boss only does a certain damage type, you can always customize it with a basalt or granite flask for a little bit more armor. Now this build's already pretty tanky, but you can continue to layer on the defenses, especially at a higher budget build like this. Since we're using Aegis Aurora, we might as well add the Divine Shield Keystone. Now we regenerate Energy Shield when we take physical damage. When I played this build personally, Storm Shroud wasn't a thing, but Storm Shroud's absolutely something you should include for complete elemental ailment immunity. And finally, boss crits are dangerous, so reduce their extra damage by 100% to round out your defenses by making your build completely immune to crits. Or again, at least the ill effects of critical strikes. And so, the end result is tanky builds like Cast on Crit Forbidden Right or Maw Mischief's Death Wish are able to take hits from uber bosses. This is far from the only way to do it, it's just one example. Just like how the mapping build I talked about earlier is just one example. Remember, you need avoidance, mitigation, and recovery to build a well-rounded character. So if you want to build something that's able to withstand everything Path of Exile has to throw at you, be sure to check out the full guide over at Maxwell GG. Avoidance is about not getting hit or not taking damage in the first place. Mitigation is for the damage that you will inevitably take. And recovery brings your health back up after taking damage. Look for defenses that specifically have synergy, such as evasion with spell suppression, to round out your ability to deal with both attacks and spells. And remember, Path of Exile is a sandbox. You get to build the castle however you want, and then it either will or won't withstand the incoming tide. For some people, having enough defenses to never die is a must, especially if you're playing something like hardcore. But for others, dying once every 20 or 30 maps isn't all that bad, and you only have so many affixes on your gear, so the more you dedicate to defense, the less you'll be able to dedicate to attack. At the end of the day, finding a good build in Path of Exile is about striking a healthy balance. And if you want to learn more about how to make builds or Path of Exile mechanics, do be sure to check out other episodes of Path of Learning. But now I'm curious, what's your favorite defensive layer in Path of Exile, and which category does it fall into? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, if you found this helpful, as it's a great way to tell me to make more content like this. Now before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. If you're still here and want something else to watch, maybe check out my Path of Learning Resistances guide, as that'll teach you everything you need to know about elemental resistances in Path of Exile. Something that's both fundamental and crucial. Or, if you want something else, maybe try the recommendation on screen right now. But that's it for me today. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.